Wendy Clark was walking down the street, stopping from time to time and carefully studying job ads. But whenever the woman decided to try her fortune, she was always rejected. That wasn't because she didn't have the skills or experience, but because Wendy had recently served a sentence in the woman's state county jail. The orphaned woman got charged as an accomplice in a robbery case when her boyfriend committed several robberies and brought the stolen goods to her place. Being honest and slightly naive by nature, Wendy didn't even suspect that all those things were stolen. Right up until the moment when her boyfriend was detained, the gullible orphan sincerely believed that he bought all those things at a flea market to resell them later. During the investigation, the man deliberately blamed his girlfriend for some of the crimes, thereby decreasing his own sentence. Trying to exonerate herself, Wendy exhausted all the arguments in her defense, but she never managed to convince the jury. There was no one to help the young woman, and all the friends she thought she had turned away from her as soon as the judge announced the verdict. Wendy preferred not to think of the time she'd spent in the woman's prison, and after her release, she firmly decided to start a new life. The young woman thought that if she put in enough effort, she'd be able to find a job and everything would be fine. But in fact, the situation was much more complicated than Wendy could have imagined. Most employers refused to even talk to the ex-con, let alone hire her. Some of them did talk to her for a little bit, but they were all very condescending and arrogant, which made the woman feel even worse about her already hopeless situation. Wendy tried her luck at least a dozen potential job places, but she got rejected every time. When the woman was getting desperate, luck finally smiled on her when she met the owner of a small cafe located on the corner of Park Street. "I won't hire you as a waitress, of course, but I can offer you the position of a cleaning lady. 6 days a week, and it's a lot of work, but the salary isn't bad," Andrew Simon suggested, sounding rather friendly. Wendy didn't take long to think about it and accepted the offer a minute later. The work really was hard and exhausting. Wendy's duties didn't just include keeping the tables clean and washing the floors, but also keeping clean the areas adjacent to the building. In fact, the owner needed to hire a janitor for that job, but he decided to kill two birds with one stone and took advantage of the woman's position, loading her with all kinds of work. Knowing full well that she wouldn't be able to find a better job, Wendy stoically endured all the hardships and believed that one day her life would change for the better. One day, while raking the leaves out back, the young cleaner heard a strange squeaking sound coming from the garbage cans. Wondering who it could be, Wendy stepped closer and saw a small puppy shivering from the cold and poking its nose into an empty can of food. "How did you get here, you poor thing?" the woman asked softly. The puppy yelped amusingly in response and wagged his tail. Wendy's eyes immediately filled with tears as she thought about the puppy going hungry and freezing without shelter in the cold weather. Having picked up the puppy, the woman decided to take him home. Wendy named the puppy Lucky, hinting that he was born under a lucky star because he was fortunate enough to have found a loving home. Now the woman had something to look forward to at the end of her shift. She always hurried home where her loving four-legged friend was waiting for her. Whenever Wendy had a day off, she took Lucky for a walk in the park, where the puppy would go crazy chasing pigeons and barking at squirrels. One day, as the woman took her dog out for a walk, she noticed a little boy of about 7 years old riding his bike by the road and doing tricks on it. Wendy's heart sank when she saw that in just a moment, the boy would ride out onto the street, where traffic was always very busy. Leaving Lucky by the store, the woman rushed towards the little boy as fast as she could, grabbed his bike, and pulled him towards herself. At the same time, she heard a squeal of brakes and her face got blasted with warm air from the overheated engine of a passing truck. The boy looked at the woman. He was terrified, but then his lips stretched into a sweet smile. "You should be more careful, or you could end up getting hit by a car. Are you out here alone? Where are your parents?" Wendy asked as softly as possible. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to scare you." It's just that my nanny doesn't like to take me outside, so I ran away while she was in the store. Don't worry, I was going to come back," the boy answered, lowering his eyes guiltily. Wendy smiled, stroking the boy on the head, and said, "Okay, let me take you home, and you can play with my dog Lucky on your way, okay? He's that handsome guy standing by the store." "Wow, a real dog? I'd love to play with him," the boy exclaimed joyfully. As it turned out a little later, the boy's name was Bobby, and he lived with his grandparents in a 2-story house on Main Street. The boy's mother died in labor, and his father never took care of him. Pointing the way to his house, Bobby kept telling Wendy that he was sure he'd seen her before. "I don't think so, Bobby. It seems rather unlikely," the woman answered, involuntarily remembering the years she spent in prison. Finally, they reached Bobby's house. Wendy stopped in her tracks and couldn't believe her eyes. Bobby's grandparents didn't just have a big house, it was truly huge. It had massive columns in the corners, a sloping roof covered with red tiles and carved window seals made of the finest woods. "Wow, is this where you live?" Wendy asked, admiring the house. "Well, yes. Why? I grew up here," the kid replied nonchalantly. Having come to the door, the woman left Lucky outside and followed Bobby inside the house. They immediately came face to face with the boy's elderly nanny, who turned out to be rather quarrelsome and lazy. Having looked Wendy in the eyes, the nanny refrained from commenting and retired to the servants' room, having proudly raised her head. "Grandma and Grandpa aren't home yet. They went to the mayor's birthday party," Bobby said with disappointment when he found the note addressed to him in the living room. Wendy nodded understandingly and was about to head for the exit when she suddenly saw a strange painting on the wall. It depicted a pretty woman with brown hair and beautiful blue eyes. Looking at the painting, the woman couldn't help but think that the woman bore a striking resemblance to Wendy herself. "Do you know who that is on the painting?" Wendy asked softly. Bobby looked at the guest in surprise and shook his head. "I don't know, ma'am, but my grandmother says that this painting is very important to her." Wendy took a closer look and thought that the woman in the painting really did look like her. Of course, there were some differences, but they were mostly the hairstyle and the choice of clothes. Wendy had been cutting her hair short for a long time, but the stranger in the painting had beautiful, long hair with curls falling down onto her shoulders and getting into her eyes. As for everything else, though, the woman looked like Wendy's twin, which surprised the woman greatly. Wendy was pulled out of her anxious thoughts by the sound of the door opening. She turned her head and saw an elderly couple standing in the doorway. At that moment, Bobby's grandmother met her guest's eyes and exclaimed in astonishment, "Rachel! Daughter, is that really you?" Wendy was so shocked that she didn't even know what to say. Looking at the woman, she decided that she must have made a mistake. But when Bobby's grandfather said the same thing, Wendy started feeling very uncomfortable. "What's going on here? What do you mean, daughter? I'm Wendy Clark. I grew up in an orphanage, and I've never been in this house before," the woman exclaimed in surprise. But Margaret and Stephen Nelson didn't think so. Looking at Wendy with eyes full of tears, the elderly couple was sure that their guest was somehow their daughter who died 7 years ago. Having finally calmed down at least a little bit, Margaret and Stephen realized that the woman standing in front of them really wasn't Rachel. But who was she? The question bothered both the parents of the deceased woman and Wendy, who found herself in a very awkward situation. This painting was made by a local artist. He was secretly in love with Rachel. So one day, he gave her such a special gift for her birthday, Stephen Nelson said, pointing to the wall. Wendy already realized that Bobby simply didn't know that it was his late mother who was depicted in the painting. The old couple probably didn't want the boy to suffer any more than he had to, being already deprived of parental love and care. But Wendy's appearance in their house turned everything upside down. Stephen and Margaret Nelson found it very interesting that Wendy grew up in an orphanage. After all, their late daughter Rachel wasn't adopted and grew up in a regular family. And then Margaret Nelson remembered something that had actually been haunting her for many years. Margaret was pregnant with twins, but according to the doctor who delivered her babies, one of the girls didn't survive and was born dead. Could he really have lied to me? But why? Mrs. Nelson exclaimed with tears in her eyes. The information overload made Wendy dizzy, so she sat on the edge of a chair. Making the only right decision in the situation, Stephen decided to entrust the investigation of his complicated case to a professional. So he called his PI friend and described everything in detail. Then the elderly businessman invited Wendy to stay with them until the situation cleared up. "Can I play with Miss Clark's dog, Lucky, please?" Bobby begged. "Of course you can. The house is big enough for the dog. Lucky is free to run around as he pleases," Stephen Nelson answered with a smile. A completely different life began for Wendy. The millionaire's house was warm and cozy, and there was a park nearby where the woman took Lucky and Bobby. Margaret and Stephen felt in their hearts that Wendy was their daughter and didn't believe that they could be mistaken. Fortunately, the elderly couple was right, and the private detective confirmed what they knew in their hearts all along. As it turned out, the on-call doctor had a grudge against the Nelson couple and deliberately lied to the exhausted woman, saying that one of her daughters had died. In fact, Wendy was alive, but the despicable doctor gave her to some alcoholic woman whose child was actually stillborn. Later, the woman gave Wendy up, having brought her to an orphanage, which made this story even more complicated. Meanwhile, Margaret Nelson raised her daughter, Rachel, unaware that her twin sister Wendy was actually alive too. "So does this mean that Miss Clark is my aunt?" Bobby exclaimed happily. "Yes, dear, she is your aunt and our daughter," Margaret Nelson said with tears in her eyes. The elderly couple decided not to go looking for the doctor who stole their baby at the hospital. He was probably just a miserable, pitiful person who decided to ruin the life of young parents for being rich and happy. Maybe that wasn't the right decision, but the Nelsons simply didn't want to start their new life by going to court over something that happened 25 years ago. Instead, they cared for Wendy in a way that no one had ever done before. Having learned that she was the daughter of a wealthy couple, Wendy quit her job at the cafe and opened a volunteer center for homeless people and people in difficult life situations. There, Wendy met her future husband, who was a volunteer and shared her views on life. As for little Bobby, he started thinking of Wendy Clark as his mother and spending all of his free time with Lucky, who had become his new and loyal friend.